A chance encounter that changed everything. The alarm clock shrieked at 4:30 a.m., jolting Isabella Hart from her restless sleep. She groaned, rubbing her tired eyes before forcing herself upright. The air in her tiny apartment was cold, the heater barely working despite her best efforts to fix it. She wrapped herself in an old, oversized cardigan and shuffled toward the kitchenette, where the coffee maker sputtered to life. The only luxury she had allowed herself in years. Her mornings were always the same. Wake up before dawn, pull on her faded waitress uniform, and catch the first bus to Benny's Diner. By 5:30 a.m., she would be setting up tables, preparing for another long shift filled with truck drivers, early rising construction workers, and exhausted nurses coming off night shifts. It wasn't the life she had dreamed of, but it was the life she had. By 2:00 p.m., when her shift ended, she would rush across town to her second job at a grocery store, restocking shelves until closing. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept her going, kept the lights on. Barely. The bus ride to work was quiet. The city was just waking up, a few cars honking in the distance as streetlights flickered out. Isabella pulled her coat tighter around her body, thinking about how she had ended up here, alone in a city that never cared whether she sank or swam. Once she had big dreams. College, a career in art restoration. But dreams didn't pay the bills, and after her mother passed away, she had no choice but to drop out and work. There was no safety net, no family to catch her if she fell. Just her, struggling against the current. As she stepped off the bus and walked toward the diner, she spotted a black SUV parked across the street, its windows tinted dark. It wasn't uncommon to see expensive cars in this part of town, but something about this one made her uneasy. It had been there yesterday, too. Shaking off the thought, she stepped inside the warmth of the diner, where the smell of fresh coffee and frying bacon filled the air. The day passed in a blur of orders, coffee refills, and hurried footsteps across the greasy floors. By the time her shift ended, her feet ached, and exhaustion pulled at her limbs, but she didn't have time to rest. The grocery store was waiting. By the time she got off her second shift, the sun had long set, and the air had turned bitterly cold. Wrapping her scarf around her neck, she started the long walk home, cutting through the park as she always did. Then she heard it, a soft whimper. Isabella froze mid-step. The park was nearly empty at this hour, the only sounds the distant hum of the city and a rustling of wind through bare branches. Another whimper. She turned toward a bench, barely able to make out a small bundle beneath it. Her breath hitched as she stepped closer. A baby, wrapped in a worn but expensive-looking blanket, no more than a few months old. The infant stirred, blinking up at her with wide, innocent eyes. Isabella's heart pounded. Who would leave a baby here? She scanned the park, suddenly hyper-aware of her surroundings. Was this some kind of trap? Was the mother nearby? Then she saw it, a silver bracelet dangling from the baby's tiny wrist, engraved with delicate cursive letters. Soph. The rest of the name was too worn to read. As she crouched down, reaching out hesitantly, the baby's tiny fingers curled around hers with surprising strength. Her breath caught in her throat. Who was she? Where had she come from? The SUV. Her stomach twisted. The same black SUV was idling near the park entrance, its headlights off but engine running. A surge of protective instinct rushed through her. Something was wrong. She pulled out her phone, about to dial 911. But then she hesitated. What if this was more complicated than it seemed? What if calling the police put this baby in danger? The SUV moved slowly, almost like it was watching her. Without thinking, Isabella did the only thing that felt right. She picked up the baby, wrapped the blanket tightly around her tiny body, and hurried home. Whatever was happening, this child needed her. And in that moment, Isabella made a silent promise. She would protect her, no matter what. A mother's fight begins. Isabella barely slept that night. The baby, whom she had instinctively started calling Sophie, slept peacefully in a makeshift crib she had assembled from pillows and blankets. Meanwhile, Isabella lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. What had she done? She should have called the police. She should have turned the baby over to someone who could help. But the moment she held Sophie in her arms, she knew she couldn't let her go. What if the wrong people got her? That SUV, it had been there before, watching. If someone abandoned her, why would they be circling the park hours later? Fear settled deep in Isabella's chest, but it wasn't fear for herself. It was for Sophie. By morning, she knew what she had to do. She needed to make things legal. A battle begins. The Department of Child Services was a gray, soulless building with flickering fluorescent lights and a waiting room that smelled like old coffee and disinfectant. Isabella sat nervously in a metal chair, cradling Sophie in her arms. "Miss Hart," a woman called. Isabella stood, holding Sophie close. The social worker, Mrs. Klein, gestured for her to follow into a small office cluttered with stacks of paperwork. "You found an abandoned baby and did not immediately call the police?" Mrs. Klein asked, raising an eyebrow as she read over the form Isabella had filled out. I was scared," Isabella admitted. "I saw an SUV watching the park, and something didn't feel right. I didn't want her to fall into the wrong hands." Mrs. Klein sighed, adjusting her glasses. "That's understandable, but you need to understand something. Situations like these have procedures." She leaned forward, giving Isabella a sharp look. "You can't just decide to keep her." Isabella tightened her grip on Sophie, who slept soundly against her chest. "I don't want to take her away from her real family. But if no one comes forward, I want to be the one to take care of her." Mrs. Klein hesitated. "You realize that's not how it works, right?" "I'll do whatever I have to," Isabella said firmly. Mrs. Klein studied her for a long moment before sighing. "I'll start an inquiry into missing persons. In the meantime, she'll be placed in temporary foster care." "No," Isabella blurted out before she could stop herself. "Please, just let me keep her until you find out who she belongs to. I'll take care of her." Mrs. Klein rubbed her temples. "Do you have any experience with children, Miss Hart?" "No," Isabella admitted, "but I know I can do this. I may not be rich, but I'll find a way. You work 2 jobs. You live in a small apartment with barely enough space for yourself. Raising a child isn't easy, especially alone." Isabella swallowed hard. "I'll figure it out." Mrs. Klein sighed. "I'll see what I can do. But understand this. You are not her legal guardian. If someone steps forward claiming her, or if the system decides another placement is better, you'll have to let her go." Isabella nodded, even though the thought of losing Sophie made her heart clench painfully. For now, at least, Sophie was safe, and that was all that mattered. Struggles of a new mother. Taking care of Sophie while juggling 2 jobs was harder than Isabella ever imagined. She found a retired neighbor, Mrs. Langley, who agreed to watch Sophie while she worked. It wasn't perfect, but it was the best she could do. Nights became a blur of bottle feedings, diaper changes, and whispered lullabies. She learned that Sophie hated the sound of the city at night, so Isabella started sleeping with her on her chest, rubbing slow circles on her back until she calmed. She learned that Sophie loved being held, that she would let out a soft, happy sigh whenever Isabella stroked her tiny fingers. She learned that no matter how exhausted she was, no matter how much her body ached from working back-to-back shifts, she would always have the energy to care for Sophie. And she learned something else. She wasn't just taking care of Sophie. She was falling in love with her. A warning. 2 weeks later, Isabella was walking home from work when she saw it again. The black SUV, parked across from her apartment. Her heart pounded. She hurried inside, locking the door behind her before peering through the blinds. The SUV idled for a moment longer, then pulled away. Someone was watching them. Fear clawed up her throat. She had done everything by the book, reported Sophie to Child Services, followed the process. But what if this wasn't a case of an abandoned child? What if someone had deliberately left Sophie in that park? And what if they wanted her back? The thought made Isabella's blood run cold. She needed help. A ghost from the past. 3 weeks after finding Sophie, Isabella was called back to child services. She sat stiffly in the chair. Sophie nestled against her. Mrs. Klein folded her hands on the desk. "We found a match." Isabella's stomach dropped. "A man has come forward claiming to be Sophie's father. He's provided proof. A missing persons report filed nearly 2 years ago, pictures of Sophie as an infant, even a DNA test." Isabella gripped the arms of the chair. "Who is he?" Mrs. Klein hesitated. "Alexander Wolf." Isabella's breath hitched. She had heard that name before. Everyone in the city had. Alexander Wolf, the billionaire CEO of Wolf Enterprises, a man so powerful he practically owned half of the city's real estate, a man whose name was whispered in business circles, feared by rivals, a man who, 2 years ago, had been in the headlines when his wife mysteriously disappeared with their newborn daughter. Sophie. A knock at the door. That night, Isabella was sitting on her couch, still reeling from the news, when a knock sounded at her door. Her stomach clenched. Slowly, she rose to her feet. Another knock. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, and opened the door. Standing in the dim hallway was a man. Tall, impeccably dressed, broad shoulders, sharp jawline, piercing blue eyes that locked onto her with quiet intensity. Alexander Wolf. He exuded authority, power, and something else, something raw. "Miss Hart," he said, his voice controlled yet edged with something deeper. "I believe you have my daughter." Isabella's grip tightened on the doorframe. Her world was about to change, and she wasn't sure she was ready. The bargain for Sophie. A tense meeting. Isabella's heart pounded in her chest as she stood frozen in the doorway, staring up at the man before her. Alexander Wolf. The name alone carried weight. His presence was overwhelming, his sharp blue eyes piercing through her as if he could see every fear, every thought racing through her mind. Behind her, Sophie let out a small, sleepy whimper from her crib. The sound snapped Isabella back into reality. She tightened her grip on the doorknob. "I don't know what you expect me to do," she said cautiously, keeping her voice steady, even though her insides felt like they were shaking. "She's under my care. I reported her to child services. I followed the law." Alexander's jaw clenched. "I'm aware." There was something in his tone, something controlled, but barely. As if he was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, but was suddenly forced to navigate uncharted waters. "You're Isabella Hart," he stated, as if testing the name on his tongue. "Waitress, grocery clerk, no criminal record, no family in the city, barely scraping by." His words weren't cruel, just factual. But they hit like a slap anyway. Her spine stiffened. "And yet, I've been the one raising your daughter these past few weeks." A flicker of something passed through his gaze, something like regret. Isabella crossed her arms, forcing herself to meet his stare. "If you're here to try and take her, you'll have to go through the system like everyone else." Alexander exhaled slowly, rubbing his fingers along his temple as if fighting off a headache. "I'm not here to take her from you." That surprised her. "I want to talk," he added. "Please." Isabella hesitated, but something in his voice, the rawness behind the controlled exterior, made her step back. "Fine." She opened the door wider, motioning for him to enter. "But if you so much as look at Sophie the wrong way, I'll throw you out myself." He gave her a small, almost amused glance before stepping inside. An unexpected proposition. Alexander Wolf looked out of place in her tiny apartment. Everything about him screamed wealth. The crisp, tailored suit, the expensive watch that probably cost more than her entire yearly income. But here he was, standing in her cramped living room, taking in the surroundings with unreadable eyes. His gaze landed on Sophie, who was fast asleep in her crib, tiny fists curled up beside her face. His entire body went still. For a long moment, he said nothing, just stared at her as if he were memorizing every detail. Isabella shifted uncomfortably. "Why did you come here?" she asked, breaking the silence. Alexander turned back to her. "I've been looking for my daughter for 2 years." His voice was quieter now, more raw. "When my wife disappeared with her, I exhausted every resource trying to find them. But no leads, no trace. It was like they vanished off the face of the earth." Isabella frowned. "Then how did you find us?" "Security footage," he said simply. "One of my private investigators traced Sophie's bracelet, the same one she was wearing when she was taken. Then I saw footage of you in the park that night." Isabella's stomach twisted. So someone did leave her there on purpose. Alexander nodded grimly. The people who had her, they weren't good people. A chill ran down Isabella's spine. "That's why I don't want to disrupt her life further," he continued. "I don't want her caught in a legal battle between us." She narrowed her eyes. "What are you suggesting?" Alexander met her gaze. "A deal." Isabella blinked. "A deal. You clearly care about her," he said, "and I respect that. So instead of fighting this in court, let's make an arrangement that benefits Sophie." She crossed her arms. "And what exactly would this arrangement be?" "I want to be part of her life," Alexander said firmly. "I can provide for her. Education, medical care, a future. But I don't want to rip her away from the only stability she knows." Isabella's heart pounded. "So you're saying you don't want full custody?" "I want shared custody," he clarified. "You've been her caretaker. I won't take that from you. But I'm her father. I can't just disappear." Isabella took a shaky breath. It wasn't what she expected. She had spent the last 24 hours preparing herself for a legal fight, for threats and power plays. But this was something else entirely. "You'd really agree to that?" she asked skeptically. "You, Alexander Wolf, billionaire CEO, would be okay sharing custody with a broke waitress?" A muscle in his jaw twitched. "Money doesn't make me a better parent. It just gives me resources. You give her something I can't. Comfort, stability, love." Isabella stared at him. For the first time, she saw not just a powerful businessman, but a man who had lost something irreplaceable, a father who had been searching for his child. She exhaled. "And if I say no?" Alexander's gaze darkened slightly. "Then I'll have no choice but to go through the courts. And we both know that money plays a big role in legal battles." There it was, the power beneath the surface. Isabella clenched her fists. "But," he added, voice softer, "I don't want to do that. I want us to do what's best for Sophie. Together." She swallowed hard, looking down at the sleeping child between them. Sophie deserved stability. She deserved love. And as much as Isabella wanted to protect her, she couldn't deny that having a father in her life might be good for her. But could she trust Alexander? Could she trust herself to let him in? "Give me time to think," she finally said. Alexander nodded. "Take all the time you need." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a card, and placed it on the table. "My number. Call me when you're ready." Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the door. Isabella watched him go, her mind spinning with 1,000 thoughts. She had gone from a woman struggling to survive to the guardian of a child whose existence had just upended everything. And now she was about to make the biggest decision of her life. Would she fight to keep Sophie all to herself? Or would she take the risk and let Alexander Wolf into their world? Either way, nothing would ever be the same again. Bound by love, torn by fear, a decision that changes everything. Isabella sat in silence long after Alexander Wolf left, staring at the business card he had placed on her small second-hand coffee table. A single name, printed on thick, expensive cardstock. No title, no company name, just his personal number. He had given her power over the next step. But what was the right step? She turned to Sophie, peacefully sleeping in her crib, unaware that her entire world was hanging in the balance. Could she share Sophie with him? Could she trust a man like Alexander Wolf? She picked up the card and turned it over between her fingers. What choice did she really have? Meeting in neutral ground. 2 days later, Isabella dialed the number. It rang once, twice. Then his deep, controlled voice came through the line. Isabella. Her breath caught for a moment before she forced herself to speak. We need to talk. Name a time and place, Alexander said instantly. Tomorrow. The coffee shop on 5th Street. Noon. I'll be there. He hung up without another word. The next afternoon, Isabella sat at a corner table in the small, cozy cafe, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Her heart pounded as the door opened. Alexander entered, dressed in a dark sweater and jeans, instead of his usual intimidating business attire. Yet he still carried himself with an air of quiet authority. He spotted her immediately and approached with a slow, measured pace. Thank you for meeting me, he said, settling into the seat across from her. Isabella took a breath. I've thought about what you said. About shared custody. Alexander watched her intently. You were right about one thing, she admitted. I love Sophie. I want to do what's best for her. His expression didn't change, but she saw the way his shoulders tensed slightly, as if bracing himself. But she continued, I don't trust you yet, and I don't trust that your world won't destroy ours. Alexander exhaled slowly. I understand. So here's my counteroffer. He leaned forward slightly, intrigued. We start with supervised visits, she said firmly. No overnight stays, no sudden disruptions. We ease into this. Alexander nodded. That's reasonable. And no court involvement, she added, narrowing her eyes. If we do this, we do it on our terms, not in a courtroom where lawyers can twist things to their advantage. A slow smile tugged at the corner of Alexander's mouth. You're tougher than you look, he murmured. She lifted her chin. I've had to be. He studied her for a moment before nodding. I agree to your terms. Relief mixed with anxiety swirled in Isabella's chest. There was no going back now. The first visit. The first time Alexander came to Isabella's apartment for his scheduled visit, he showed up with a stuffed elephant and a carefully restrained expression. Sophie, who had no real memory of him, eyed him warily from her spot on the couch. Hi, Sophie, Alexander said, his voice softer than Isabella expected. Sophie clung to Isabella's side. Who's that? Isabella smoothed Sophie's curls gently. This is Mr. Alexander. He's a friend. Alexander crouched to her level and held out the stuffed animal. This is Ellie, he said. She's an explorer. She loves to go on adventures with people she trusts. Sophie hesitated, then slowly reached for the toy. A flicker of something raw crossed Alexander's face as she took it. Thank you, Sophie mumbled, hugging the elephant close. Isabella watched the exchange carefully. For the next hour, Alexander stayed on the floor, playing blocks with Sophie, never once forcing his presence. By the time he left, Sophie had started calling him Mr. Alex. It was a start. The ghost of the past. Days turned into weeks, and Alexander's visits became a regular part of their lives. At first, Isabella was wary of how easily he slipped into their world, how seamlessly he adapted to bedtime stories, to coloring at the kitchen table, to pushing Sophie on the swings at the park. She had expected him to remain distant, to struggle with the simplicity of their life. But he didn't. He thrived in it. Which was why, one evening, when he didn't show up at their usual time, Isabella's stomach twisted with unease. She told herself he was just busy. But then a knock came at her door. And when she opened it, a woman was standing there. Tall, strikingly beautiful, with deep brown eyes that looked eerily familiar. Hello, Isabella, the woman said smoothly. Isabella's stomach dropped. She didn't need an introduction. She knew exactly who this was. Sophie's biological mother. The woman who had disappeared 2 years ago. The woman who had abandoned her daughter in a park. Clara Wolfe. The past comes knocking. "I want to see my daughter," Clara said, her gaze sharp, unapologetic. Isabella's fingers curled around the doorframe. "She's not your daughter anymore." Clara let out a soft laugh. "She's always been mine." "No," Isabella said coldly. "She stopped being yours the day you left her on a park bench." Clara tilted her head. "Is that what you think happened?" Anger flared in Isabella's chest. "That's what I know happened." Clara sighed. "Look, I made mistakes. I admit that. But I did what I thought was right at the time. You have no idea what I was going through." "I don't care what you were going through," Isabella snapped. "Sophie is happy. She's safe. And you don't get to walk in here and disrupt that just because you suddenly decided you miss her." Clara's gaze darkened. "You have no legal right to keep me away from my daughter." Ice filled Isabella's veins. Before she could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "Actually," Alexander said from behind Clara, his tone like steel, "she does." Clara stiffened and turned to face him. Alexander's expression was unreadable, but there was a quiet fury in his eyes. "This isn't your fight, Alexander," Clara said smoothly. "She's my daughter." Alexander stepped closer, his presence towering over Clara's. "She was your daughter, but you walked away. And now you don't get to come back and pretend nothing happened." Clara's lips curled into a smirk. "You really think you can keep me away?" "I don't think," Alexander said, pulling out a folded piece of paper from his coat. "I know." He handed it to her. Isabella peered over Clara's shoulder. It was a legal document, a signed custody agreement between Alexander and Isabella, giving both of them legal guardianship. Clara's face paled. "You signed away your rights when you abandoned her," Alexander said coldly. "And Isabella? She's not just some bystander in this. She's Sophie's mother." Clara's jaw tightened. "This isn't over," she whispered. She turned and walked away, disappearing down the hallway. Isabella exhaled shakily, her heart racing. Alexander turned to her. "Are you okay?" She looked at him, at the document in his hands, at the silent understanding in his gaze, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she realized she wasn't fighting alone anymore. The fallout of Clara's return. Alexander shut the door behind Clara and turned to face Isabella, his jaw tight with anger. "Are you okay?" he asked again, his voice softer this time. Isabella let out a shaky breath, her fingers still curled into fists. "I don't know." Her heart was still racing, her mind spinning with 1,000 thoughts. Clara had stood there, smug, confident, acting as if she had every right to reclaim Sophie after abandoning her. And the worst part, legally, she might have had that right. She sank onto the couch, her hands shaking. "She's going to fight for her, isn't she?" Alexander hesitated before sitting down beside her. "Probably." "Can she win?" Isabella whispered. Alexander ran a hand through his hair. "The system favors biological parents, but she signed away her parental rights when she disappeared. The courts won't take her claim lightly." "But you just said the system favors biological parents," Isabella pressed, panic rising in her throat. "That's why I had my lawyers draw this up." He lifted the custody agreement he had shown Clara, his grip tightening. "It's official now. We both have legal rights, and that makes it harder for her to challenge us." Us. The word sent an unexpected wave of warmth through Isabella's chest. She wasn't alone in this anymore. Sophie had two people who would fight for her. "But she won't stop," Isabella murmured, staring at the door as if Clara might reappear any second. She didn't even seem nervous. "She knows something we don't." Alexander exhaled sharply. "She might have legal counsel backing her already. Her family is powerful. I'll have my team investigate." Isabella shook her head, her throat dry. "I can't lose Sophie." Alexander turned to face her fully, his voice quiet but firm. "You won't." She looked up at him, their eyes locking. Something shifted in the air. For the first time, she let herself believe him. Clara's next move. The next morning, Isabella woke up to her phone buzzing nonstop. She frowned, reaching for it, only to see dozens of notifications. Her stomach dropped. The headlines were everywhere. Breaking news. Billionaire Alexander Wolf's lost daughter found, but in whose custody? Exclusive interview with Clara Wolf. I wasn't ready, but I am now. Mother of missing Harris speaks out, claimed she was manipulated into giving up her child. Isabella's blood turned to ice. She opened one of the articles, scanning through Clara's words. When I left, I was in a bad place. I was struggling. I was afraid. But I never abandoned my daughter. I only wanted what was best for her. Now that I've recovered, I want to be in her life. I want to raise her the way I always intended. Rage bubbled inside Isabella. She wanted to scream, to throw something, to tell the world that Clara was lying, that she had left Sophie alone in a park, that Isabella had been the one who picked her up, fed her, loved her. She didn't just get to walk back in and act like none of it had happened. A knock sounded at her door. Isabella shot up, heart pounding, but when she opened it, she found Alexander standing there, his face like thunder. You saw it, he said darkly. Of course I did, Isabella snapped. She's playing the victim. And now the world thinks I stole her daughter. Alexander clenched his jaw. She's setting the stage for a legal battle. Isabella swallowed hard. What do we do? Alexander didn't hesitate. We fight back. A war begins. That night, Isabella met with Alexander's legal team in his penthouse, a place so luxurious it made her feel like she didn't belong. But tonight, she wasn't focused on the marble floors or the breathtaking skyline view. She was focused on the papers spread out on the glass coffee table. Clara Wolf is positioning herself as the sympathetic mother, Alexander's lead attorney, Mark Whitmore, said. Public opinion will matter. We need to prove that removing Sophie from you would be damaging. Isabella bristled. Removing her from me? She's my daughter. Mark nodded. And you've done a remarkable job raising her. We need to highlight that. The courts won't just look at love. They'll look at stability. Your jobs, your income, your living conditions. Everything will be scrutinized. Isabella's stomach clenched. She already knew she wasn't in the same league as Clara Wolf financially. Clara's attorneys will argue that she can provide a better life for Sophie, Mark continued. And if the judge is swayed by that, it could be an uphill battle. A heavy silence filled the room. Then Alexander spoke. I'll make sure that doesn't happen. Mark sighed. Mr. Wolf, your name being attached to this already puts you in a complicated position. The media is calling it a custody war between the billionaire and the struggling waitress. If you're too aggressive, it could backfire. Alexander's expression turned to stone. So what do you suggest? Mark hesitated. We counter her public narrative. Clara says she wants Sophie back. We show the world that you and Isabella have already built a loving, stable home for her. Isabella shifted uncomfortably. How do we do that? Mark folded his hands. The simplest way. He looked between them. You move in together. Silence. Isabella's breath caught. Alexander's gaze snapped to Mark's. Excuse me. Mark shrugged. Right now, your biggest weakness is appearing separate. The court could rule that Sophie is being raised in a fractured environment. But if you two present yourselves as a unified parental team, if you live under one roof, it strengthens your case tremendously. Isabella's mind spun. Live with Alexander Wolf. In his penthouse. Impossible. She opened her mouth to argue, but Alexander spoke first. We need other options, he said stiffly. Mark sighed. There are other options, but none as powerful as this one. Isabella exhaled shakily. This is insane. Mark raised an eyebrow. Is it? The courts are about to decide the fate of the child you both love. If you want to win this, you need to show the judge, and the world that you are both equally committed to raising Sophie, and that means appearing together. Isabella looked at Alexander. For the first time since meeting him, he looked uncertain. A man used to controlling everything, suddenly faced with something out of his hands. Then he turned to Isabella, and in that moment she realized something terrifying. This wasn't just about Sophie anymore. This was about them. A dangerous arrangement. That night, Isabella lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Move in with Alexander Wolf. Live under the same roof as him. Was she really considering this? Yes, because no matter how insane it sounded, Mark was right. This was war, and she would do whatever it took to keep Sophie safe, even if it meant sharing a home with the most powerful and dangerous man she had ever met. A fragile alliance. Moving into the lion's den. Isabella had never set foot inside a penthouse before. Standing in the grand foyer of Alexander Wolf's luxury home, she felt like an intruder. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the glittering skyline, the city stretching far beyond, twinkling like fallen stars. The furniture was sleek, modern, and impossibly expensive. Even the air smelled different, like polished wood and something faintly masculine, like Alexander himself. Sophie, oblivious to the tension, squealed in delight. "Mama, look!" She pointed toward a massive glass case filled with books. So many stories. Isabella swallowed the lump in her throat. Was this really happening? She turned to Alexander, who stood a few feet away, watching her reaction. He was dressed more casually than usual. An open-collared shirt, sleeves rolled up, but he still exuded quiet power. "You'll have your own space," he said smoothly, gesturing toward a hallway. "I had the east wing of the penthouse prepared for you and Sophie." East wing. Isabella echoed, blinking. Her entire apartment could fit inside this place 3 times over, and he was talking about wings. Sophie had already run ahead, peeking into the rooms with wide-eyed wonder. "Mama, this room is pink," she called. "Can I sleep here?" Alexander's lips twitched. "I had it decorated for her. Figured she'd like it." Isabella turned sharply. "You planned this before I even agreed." He met her gaze, unapologetic. "I prepared for the possibility." Her fingers clenched around the strap of her bag. "You don't like losing, do you?" A flicker of amusement danced in his eyes. "No, I don't." The tension between them was thick. 2 people forced into an arrangement neither fully trusted. But they had both made their choice. For Sophie. And now, there was no turning back. The rules of coexistence. That night, after Sophie had fallen asleep in her new room, curled up with her stuffed elephant, Ellie, Isabella found herself sitting across from Alexander in his grand kitchen. Between them sat untouched mugs of tea. "We need rules," she said, arms crossed. Alexander arched an eyebrow. "Rules? If we're going to do this, we need boundaries," Isabella said firmly. "I don't want Sophie getting confused. This isn't a real family. It's a temporary arrangement for the courts." Alexander studied her for a long moment. "And what do you propose?" Isabella hesitated, suddenly aware of how close they were sitting. She had expected a cold businessman, someone distant and detached. Instead, she had found a man who tucked blankets around his daughter, who listened intently when Sophie babbled about her favorite cartoons. A man who wasn't as easy to hate as she wanted him to be. She pushed those thoughts aside. "Rule 1, she began. "We don't pretend to be something we're not. No acting like a married couple in front of Sophie." "Agreed," Alexander said, though something unreadable flickered in his expression. "Rule 2, no interfering in each other's personal lives." Alexander's gaze sharpened slightly. "Meaning?" "Meaning," Isabella said, meeting his eyes, "that if you're going to bring home—" She paused, clearing her throat. "Guests, I don't want Sophie exposed to that." Alexander's lips pressed together. "I don't bring random women home." Isabella raised an eyebrow. He sighed. "Fine. No personal entanglements in front of Sophie. She nodded. And Rule 3. She hesitated. This was the most important one. No falling in love. Alexander went very still. For a moment, the only sound was the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Then, a slow, almost amused smirk curled at the corner of his lips. Is that a warning or a promise? Isabella's face heated. It's a rule, she snapped, standing abruptly. We're here for Sophie. Nothing more. Alexander's expression turned unreadable again, but he didn't argue. Understood. Isabella turned and left the kitchen, but as she walked down the hall to her new room, her heart pounded against her ribs. She was playing with fire, and she wasn't sure she knew how to put it out. The lies we tell ourselves. Days turned into weeks. Their new life was strange, but surprisingly functional. Mornings started with Alexander drinking his black coffee at the kitchen island, while Isabella made breakfast. Sophie sat between them, alternating between chattering about school and stuffing pancakes into her mouth. Evenings were a mix of bedtime stories and whispered discussions about custody hearings. And somehow, despite their differences, they worked. But there were moments when Isabella would catch Alexander watching her across the room, his gaze lingering a second too long. Moments when she found herself drawn to him in ways she didn't understand, like the way he ruffled Sophie's hair absent-mindedly, or the rare times his composed facade cracked, revealing something raw underneath. Moments when she forgot this was all temporary, and she knew, deep down, she was breaking her own rule. The court battle begins. Then, the custody hearing date arrived. The courthouse was packed with reporters, cameras flashing as Isabella and Alexander walked in side by side. Clara was already there, seated with her high-profile lawyers, looking every bit the part of a remorseful mother. As they took their seats, Isabella felt Alexander's hand brush against hers. She startled. He didn't look at her, but his fingers curled slightly, just enough for her to know. He was there. They were in this together. Then the judge called the hearing to order. And the war for Sophie began. A family forged in fire. The courtroom showdown. The tension inside the courtroom was suffocating. Isabella sat beside Alexander, her hands clenched in her lap, her pulse hammering in her ears. Across from them, Clara Wolfe sat with her expensive lawyers, her expression carefully crafted to show just the right amount of sorrow. The judge, an older woman with stern eyes, adjusted her glasses and scanned the documents before her. This is an unusual case, she said. We have a child, Sophie Wolfe, who has been in the care of Miss Hart for over a year, despite having living biological parents. The question before us today is, what is in Sophie's best interest? Isabella swallowed hard. That was the only thing that mattered. And yet, she knew how fragile the truth could be in a courtroom filled with high-powered lawyers. Clara's attorney, a sleek man in a designer suit, stood first. Your Honor, my client, Clara Wolfe, has gone through rehabilitation, therapy, and has turned her life around. She deeply regrets her past decisions, but she was manipulated into believing her daughter would be safer elsewhere. Now she simply wants the chance to be a mother again. Lies. Every single word. Isabella's nails dug into her palm. Alexander leaned slightly toward her, voice low. Let them talk. She inhaled shakily. Miss Hart, the lawyer continued, turning toward her, while we appreciate the care you've given Sophie, you must understand that blood relations do matter. You are not her biological mother. Do you truly believe keeping Sophie from her own mother is the right thing to do? Isabella's chest tightened. She knew this would happen. They would paint her as an obstacle. The thief. She forced herself to meet the lawyer's gaze. Sophie is my daughter, she said evenly. Blood doesn't make a family. Love does. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Clara's lawyer smirked. And yet she was never yours to claim, was she? Isabella's breath caught, but before she could speak, Alexander stood. If we're discussing blood, he said coldly, then let's discuss mine. The room stilled. Alexander turned his piercing blue gaze toward the judge. I am Sophie's father, and I support Isabella's claim. Clara's lawyer looked momentarily thrown off. Mr. Wolf. Alexander cut him off. 2 years ago, I searched the world for my daughter. While I was chasing ghosts, Isabella Hart was feeding her, loving her, raising her. I will not allow that to be erased because of Clara's sudden change of heart. Clara stiffened. I am her mother. Alexander's voice turned sharp. You left her in a park. A gasp rippled through the audience. You didn't give her up legally. You abandoned her. Alexander continued, his voice like steel. And now you want to waltz back in because it's convenient, because the media is watching. Clara's eyes flashed. You don't understand what I went through. Alexander's expression hardened. I understand that when I found out where she was, I didn't let anything stop me from coming for her. That's the difference between us, Clara. You ran. I fought. Silence fell over the courtroom. The judge studied them carefully. Then she spoke. I will take everything I've heard today into consideration. Court is adjourned. And just like that, the battle moved out of their hands. The waiting game. The decision wouldn't come for another week. It was the longest week of Isabella's life. Every night, she lay awake in the penthouse, listening to the quiet hum of the city outside, wondering if this was the last time she'd get to rock Sophie to sleep. Would the court take her away? Would she lose the child who had become her entire world? She wasn't the only one struggling. Alexander had been different since the hearing. Less composed, more restless. One night, she found him standing by the window, staring at the city lights. Can't sleep, she asked quietly. He glanced at her. Neither can you. She hesitated, then stepped closer. Are you worried? Alexander exhaled. More than I've ever been. She had never seen him like this. Not the powerful businessman, not the billionaire. Just a father. A man terrified of losing his daughter. Without thinking, Isabella reached out, placing a hand on his arm. You won't lose her, she whispered. Alexander looked down at her hand, then at her, something unreadable in his expression. Neither will you, he murmured. And for the first time, she let herself believe it. The verdict. The following week, they returned to the courtroom. The judge's face was unreadable as she addressed them. This has been one of the more challenging cases I've presided over, she said. Both biological parents have rights. But this case is not just about rights. It is about the well-being of a child. Isabella's heart pounded. The judge turned to Clara first. Miss Wolf, while I recognize your attempts at rehabilitation, the fact remains that you abandoned Sophie. This court cannot ignore that. At this time, I do not find you fit to regain custody. Clara stiffened, her face paling. Isabella's breath hitched. The judge then turned to Isabella and Alexander. Mr. Wolf, Miss Hart, she said, it is clear that Sophie's best interests lie in the home you have built together. Therefore, full custody will remain with you both, together. A rush of air left Isabella's lungs. Together. They had won. She turned to Alexander, stunned. He was already watching her, relief flickering in his stormy blue eyes. Clara stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. This isn't over, she hissed before storming out. But Isabella didn't care. She turned to Sophie, who was sitting between them, blissfully unaware of the war that had just been fought for her. And for the first time in weeks, Isabella could breathe. A future together. Later that night, as they returned to the penthouse, Isabella tucked Sophie into bed. As she turned to leave, a small voice stopped her. Mama. She turned back. Yes, baby. Sophie blinked sleepily. Papa too. Isabella glanced at the doorway, where Alexander stood watching. A lump formed in her throat. Yeah, she whispered. Papa too. Sophie smiled, curling into her blankets. As Isabella and Alexander stepped out of the room together, she exhaled deeply. We did it, she murmured. Alexander nodded. We did. Then, before she could think twice, she turned and wrapped her arms around him. He stiffened for only a second before slowly, carefully, pulling her closer. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't planned. It was just two people who had fought side by side, who had built something unbreakable. A family. And for the first time, Isabella let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end. It was the beginning.